This morning I'm signing the bonding bill with one line item veto and vetoing 4 other measures related to the governance of the Metropolitan Council, related to wild rice sulfate, related to the so-called protest bill, and relating to a requirement of MNLARS, which was not adequately funded. The bonding bill, I think my letter speaks for itself. The one item where I line item veto is a $1 million grant to, essentially intended for a third party who's going to oversee MPCA. It's an unnecessary redundancy. It doesn't serve any purpose except to placate the intended recipient of that grant, even though it nominally goes through a bid process. But the rest of the bill, if you read my letter, which since I spent so long on it, I'm expecting all of you to do, and I think all the criticisms leveled at me, for example, on the emergency school aid, and then they insert $98 million grab from the Environmental Trust Fund with no hearing, no public discussion at the last minute, setting a terrible precedent, which if followed will over time deplete that trust fund and turn it into just paying interest on these kinds of projects. The bills is deficient for what's not in it, all the projects that they could not support because of their so-called arbitrary limit of $825 million, although Mr. Franz points out that if you include all of the appropriation bonds through the Environmental Trust Fund and the $400 million in highway bonds, it's really a $1.4 billion bill. But they tied themselves up in political knots with the $825 million limit, which forced them to, they forced themselves to go to the LCCMR source and other ways that really defeats the purpose of the bonding bill. And since that $825 million was ill-founded and unnecessary, it just created all other sorts of problems. I can respond to more details later. On the Metropolitan Council, I said a year ago when I vetoed the bill, very similar to this one, that I wanted all of the participating counties to be in accord with whatever was proposed, and most of the local governments, and that is not the case. 3 of the counties, Washington, Ramsey, and Hennepin, did not support this legislation. So you got a 4-3 split as I told a group that was advocates a couple weeks ago, as President Lincoln said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. And to start out with a so-called governance reform measure that 3 of the 7 counties oppose is just not the way to start any kind of reform of the Met Council. The wild rice bill, I am vetoing about, and I'm also setting up an executive order today, a working group, which very much parallels the one that was established in the legislation, with the exception that it's got a better balance to its participants. It doesn't have the authority to preempt MPCA and direct what it will or will not do next year. But it's attempting, and once again, to take what's a very controversial issue, a very one where you really have very entangled legitimate interests that they haven't seen to find a way to work things out. And I'm also saying that they're pointing out that under existing statute, the MPCA cannot enforce the present 10 parts per milliliter of sulfate until there's a viable alternative that's been passed, so there won't be able to be any enforcement of that requirement until that task is completed. The protest bill is, you know, you see reference to the letter, there are 3 existing statutes that cover legal and illegal activities related to protesting a pipeline. You know, this is just another, you know, sop to Enbridge, which they're not even asking for. The first bill was just to give them carte blanche to put the pipeline wherever they wanted, with no review from the PUC or anyone. And now this one says nobody can protest about it, and it's absolutely Nixonian in that if you're in a discussion with somebody who goes off and does something, you can be charged with a conspiracy, which is something that the Nixon administration put in to quell dissent against the Vietnam War. I happen to remember that very vividly because I was involved in it. And it was repealed after President Nixon left office by the Congress. Otherwise, most legal experts said it would have been found unconstitutional. But to say that somebody can, in a conversation, and then be held liable for the acts that somebody else commits separately is just probably unconstitutional, should be. And then finally, the auto dealers had a bill related to some of its interests regarding MNLARS, and I don't disagree with those objectives, but the legislature provided no money for DPS to carry out the mandates. They eliminated the fee, which means that their reserve funds will be depleted. And it's just, once again, you know, there's some innocent victims of the MNLARS fiasco in this session, the deputy registrars, the money that I supported, and this initiative, because the legislature just was absolutely unwilling to fund the first set of priorities that needed to be addressed to make MNLARS functional as soon as possible. And as I've said before, I really believe there are legislators who want MNLARS to continue to look as bad as possible, at least through November. And this was another example where they threw a sop to a particular interest group that would not provide the money and not allow the systemic changes to be necessary, not fund them, to really turn it around, not just for one group or another group, but for everybody in Minnesota. So with that, given that there are no questions, I'll be glad to respond.
Governor, on the Met Council, there was at least a thought that the Lewis Amendment might convince you to act differently on governance. That's the amendment that would require elected officials beyond MPOs. It sounds as though you're not particularly worried about that amendment.
Well, you're talking about the elected local officials who would then be members. You know, some people say that raises a significant conflict of interest because they're taking an oath of office to represent the interests of their particular municipality. And the purpose of the Met Council is to, even though people are representing particular areas, is to get them to look and think outside of their own particular interests to the broader interests. And if you have people whose one election depends on their, you know, satisfying the legitimate wishes of their constituents there and put them in a position where they're supposed to be looking at the broader picture, it's contradictory and may even, you know, present, I'm not saying it's a conflict of interest, but some people, Senator Lass, for example, has raised that. The bottom line is, I mean, in the 40+ years I've been involved with this, there have been criticisms of the Met Council, and it's a favorite whipping boy of some local governments for everything that they don't have their way. But that's the intent. It's not, you're not supposed to have it all your way in the Met Council. You're supposed to have it in a way that benefits the entire region. And so it generates a lot of animosity that way, and people have, you know, legitimate grievances with how the council is selected now. But on the other hand, no one's been able to devise an alternative that has the broad support necessary to make it, give it a starting chance. And if you have 3 of the 7 counties who are, you know, are opposed to this formulation before it even starts, I mean, you're almost dooming it to failure. So, you know, there'll be another administration next year. They'll have their own views on this subject. And there'll be a 5-month session to consider carefully what they recommend and what others recommend. And if there is, can be a consensus developed, or if somebody else decides they don't need to have a consensus, they can proceed accordingly. But I was not going to leave this in the lap of whoever succeeds me.
The comments that you raised about the use of the Environmental Trust Fund in this fashion, what tipped it in the balance for you? Why did you decide to go ahead and allow this to become law? And what do you think about the precedent this is going to set in the future for the use of that fund?
Well, unfortunately, I can't veto, if I could, veto the language that authorized the robbing of the fund, $98 million for, this purpose. I would have line item vetoed it, but because there was not an appropriation attached to that language, I could not veto it. So I'm left with, and they were unwise but shrewd. They selected projects that I proposed, some of which are funded partially elsewhere in the bill, RIM, Reinvest in Minnesota, the water pollution control or improvement projects. I mean, they pick things that I'm supportive of. And so to veto the whole, I couldn't, again, veto the language. If I line item veto those particular projects, I was cutting money out of things that are worthwhile, that should be developed. And the bill itself is so inadequate for funding that it deprive projects and organizations of money which I think will be well used. Was ill-advised. But it was difficult because, again, I disagree with that approach. I think it's a very dangerous precedent, but it's part and parcel of this whole session's disdain for good government and for proper governance, or for following existing laws and precedents. And the fact that this one, after my emergency school assistance was criticized on an almost daily basis for not giving time for a hearing, this had no hearing at all. This was developed behind closed doors, brought forth in the very 11th hour, 59th minute. There's no hearing, no public scrutiny. They just did it. And it's just the worst kind of legislating. It's the poorest form of governance. And it's unfortunately all too typical of what prevailed in this session.
Regarding school safety, after looking at that, were you concerned that vetoing a bill like this would eliminate school safety out of this legislature, which was one of the number one issues here?
Well, certainly a consideration, yes. Although they're taking the money from the budgeted reserve for no justifiable reason. There's a $329 million surplus. They just spent that elsewhere and decided they needed to take this money. So it's a poor use of the budgeted reserve fund, which is, and it was built up so that we would protect Minnesotans in future economic downturns. But that was not sufficient cause to veto it. The purpose of it is an important one.
Governor, you call the bonding bill woefully inadequate. I'm sure you view this as a missed opportunity. What areas is it primarily deficient? Is it higher ed, or is there one or two areas where you think they've really missed?
Higher education, just the basic maintenance and repair was seriously underfunded. And then some of the new projects, for example, the University of Minnesota Medical School building, things that are imperative to keep us world-class higher education institutions able to attract the best and brightest faculty, the best and brightest students. Were just not funded at all. And if you look at what was also in the supplemental budget bill, not provided to higher education, they just basically almost zeroed it out. The lack of transit, any funding in there at all for buses. They're against light rail, and they won't fund bus improvements and rapid bus transit, which is the only other public option we have for public transit in this metropolitan area and other areas like St. Cloud as well. I mean, I don't know what they're for, but I guess it's just more automobiles and other vehicles packed onto the highways and roads because there's no other alternative that they're making available.
Governor, the prominent trunk highway bonds and some of this additional money beyond the 825 is indicative of Republicans' dissatisfaction with MnDOT's priority list for corridors of commerce. How do you respond to that?
Well, MnDOT had 173 applications for corridors of commerce funding, and they followed the rules that the legislature last year were prescribed very exactingly, and they had enough money for the first 4. So there are 169 projects that were not able to be funded, and they're blaming MnDOT. And MnDOT followed precisely the additional instructions that they put in the bill last year so they could dictate where that money was going to go. And MnDOT did that exactly, and it didn't turn out with the result they wanted, so now they're blaming MnDOT. It's just ludicrous that they are trying to put this blame on MnDOT. Now, MnDOT will have a news conference later today where they're going to announce with the additional corridors of commerce funding that was made available in this session. Three additional projects? 3? So I'm not going to steal the thunder, but they're important projects for Greater Minnesota. They're good projects. But that means there are 166 that still couldn't be funded. And that just shows the backlog of really important and in many cases urgently needed highway improvement projects around the state that this legislature in the last couple of years has steadfastly opposed funding adequately. Corridors of commerce taking existing money and giving it a title, and I'm all in favor of that. I'm in favor, but it's so inadequate relative to the need and to the deterioration of our trunk highway system around the state, and that's gonna impinge on our future economic vitality. Businesses that can't get their goods to market, they can't get their employees to and from their offices, are not going to expand in Minnesota. They're going to expand somewhere else where they have that adequate infrastructure. And that's been one of our great advantages, quality public infrastructure, and we're losing that, and they've done not nearly enough about it. And they go back and say, oh, we have an $825 million bonding bill, which they've circumvented to bring it up to $1.4 billion, but shh, don't tell anybody. And they're shortchanging the future of the state.
Other questions on this topic? Are you satisfied at all with water treatment and the wastewater treatment?
Well, they didn't provide everything, but between the actual GO bonds and then these appropriation bonds, it's in the general neighborhood. So that, there's been bipartisan recognition for the last, this is the 3rd year where I've made this recommendation, and it's one of those areas where there's bipartisan recognition, and a lot of smaller towns are particularly affected because they can't afford the upgrades. So I'm glad that they can set partisan differences aside and fund this one to a large extent.
Is that one of the highlights of the bill then?
Definitely.
Governor, one thing that wasn't included in the bill ultimately was an expansion of a program with MSLP that many offenders are being court-ordered into. That was DHS's highest bonding priority. Nothing there. What's your reaction to that?
It's just, again, turning the back on the problem and sticking their head in the sands. And, there's this whole backlog of available facilities and treatment options for people from the time, for example, they're in county jails and they have a 48-hour law and they can't, there's nowhere to move them to. And then once they're in someplace like St. Peter and they're going through treatment and they need a provisional discharge to both benefit their progress but also to create a space, there's nowhere for them to go. And then the funding for those projects, Senator Senjum put money in for some mental health transition facilities, to his credit, but that's just the beginning of what's needed to deal with this.
Will your wild rice task force be required to have some type of a bill?
It very much parallels what the legislation that I vetoed set up this kind of task force, although it was not as representative of the diversity of views on that matter, and it also is basically empowered to come in and preempt MBCA with what its findings and decisions would be. This one's what a working group should be: provide recommendations to see if they can find out of this really locked-in conflict and entrenched positions on various sides of the question. They can find some common ground. And, you know, the reality is we have not had any wild rice, and we had not had any sulfate limit protection enforced at all. The 10 parts per milliliter is, in many scientific views, so limiting and so cost prohibitive to attain that MPCA basically, prior to my time and during my time, has not required that for the permitting process for a new or for a renewed permit. So there's been no regulation. So it's like the buffers, when you have nothing, no restrictions whatsoever, and then suddenly you put one down, a lot of people are unhappy. That's the same thing here. And there are still a lot of folks out there who believe that they can just continue to ignore any kind of regulation, which if the federal government had an EPA, would be something that they would contest with our state MPCA. So I mean, it's a murky area now because of all those variables. But the bottom line is, we for the long-term preservation of wild rice in this state, we need to have something that everyone's going to abide by. That's reasonable, that's cost affordable, but that's going to, you know, protect the existing wild rice for the future.
And is that report due the beginning of
December
session?
15th.
December, okay.
No last questions on this topic? Or another topic?
What other topics are there?
How many bills have you got left on your desk? Do you have-
I've signed everything else. These are except for the pension bill, we'll have a ceremonial signing tomorrow in the rotunda. We're going to have we should almost have to move it to the U.S. Bank Stadium. It's going to be well attended. But there's a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of support for that. And Mr. Francis deserves enormous credit for pulling that through, and a lot of others worked on it as well. So that's going to be the last bill, and everything is signed or vetoed.
Are you going to the DFL convention?
I am. You know what? If you win the Super Bowl, where are you going for the celebration? I'm going to the DFL convention on Saturday. I'm going Saturday morning. I'm speaking Saturday morning, and then I don't know how long I'll stay. We'll see.
Can you give us a little idea of what you might be telling them?
We got to win in November. We got to decide Friday night. Well, our two terrific senators endorse. I'm confident. But then they'll be decided among three excellent candidates for governor, and I'm saying that we got to pull together after that and work together. We're going to have a stiff fight in the fall against some very well-financed Republican candidate who won and were vying to become governor with a Republican legislature. And if you look at the items I vetoed this session and others that I was able to deflect, you get a sense of preliminary read on what a Republican governor or a Republican legislature would do next year. And then you start with things like preemption and right to work and defined contribution pension, public pension plans, and a whole host of other things that even this legislature didn't seriously attempt. That will be on the front burner next year if they have complete party control. So the stakes are enormously high. That's what I'm going to say, hugely high. And I say that, you know, candidates for election are always say this is the most important election of my lifetime, which for them it is. I'm not running for office, and I think it's the most important election of my political lifetime. So it's the message I'm leaving.
Governor, one thing about Representative Zerwas is that the White House for a bill signing on right to try legislation similar to what you signed into law here in 2015. Your thoughts on that it's now going to be a national act as well?
I'm sorry, what is these?
The right to try, allowing terminally ill patients to try experimental drugs?
I don't know the details. I can't comment on the particulars, but I think that there's got to be greater latitude given to those who are in desperate conditions and are willing to knowingly accept the risks involved to try to save their lives.
Now the legislature's over, and after tomorrow when you sign the bill, what are you going to do? Are you going to do anything different the rest of your term?
I'm going to the DFL convention.
That's the last thing this year?
No, I don't want that to. I'm still formulating that. Stay tuned. I really, literally have not cleared my desk or my brain from the demands of the session, and I'm still finishing that up. And I've given some preliminary thoughts, but I want to make myself useful for the remaining 7 months. Everybody else has written my political obituaries, but I'm not ready to sign it yet.
Governor, yeah. Right before we came in here, Senator Karen Housley asking about urging you to call a special session on a single item subject of elder care for the everything that was vetoed by you in the supplemental. I know
Well,
you
they should have
said
sent me a separate bill, and they should have worked with me to have a bill that the advocacy groups can support. I mean, AARP and other senior citizen advocacy groups said that the language in her bill ended up being worse than existing law. So, I mean, I think it's a political stunt on her part, and she had the opportunity to put together a strong bill that the advocates would support, that would rein in some of the practices and some of the misdeeds of the industry, and she just caved into the industry and gave them what they wanted and set up a couple of working groups, and now she's going to run around the state pretending she did something. Well, she didn't. She had a chance to, and she didn't. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.